Well, welcome. It's an exciting thing to be the first panel of the day for what's a wonderful conference that I believe is very multidisciplinary and really engages in really thoughtful discussions about the positives and the negatives and the risks and the benefits of things that go on here. And so we want to start today by talking about location data, which is a very, very hot topic in both the technical and regulatory landscape today. I have a wonderful panel with me. I'm Aaron Alva. I am a technologist at the Federal Trade Commission, and I'm moderating today. And then briefly, if you can say your name and area of expertise.
Hi, I am Beryl Lipton. I am an investigative researcher with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I focus a lot on police surveillance and government transparency.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Jennifer King. I am at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. I'm the Privacy and Data Policy Fellow, and my work kind of sits at the intersection of HCI and consumer privacy.
I'm Brandi Bennett. I am a private practice attorney. I've been in-house at a number of companies for 15 years, including in the data privacy space for almost 10 years now, working with everything from geolocation data to biometric data to US law to international law. So I got all the hands-on experience with all these crazy companies out there.
Yeah, so I think as you splice out our discussion today, Beryl has a kind of a government viewpoint on location data uses and practices. Jen has a kind of consumer viewpoint and vantage point from her research, and Brandi has a commercial use, commercial collection kind of perspective to kind of tease out. So I want to start by framing the issue. When we talk about location data, let's go with definitions to start. So we're going to be talking about precise location data. So that generally means whatever precise information you get from GPS. It can also mean information that you get from triangulating Wi-Fi signals through collecting BSS-IDs from Wi-Fi access points. It's what gives you the precision of knowing where an individual or device is at a particular location. So that is what we're talking about today. We can kind of splice on the edges when we talk about what is precise, what is coarse. There's a lot of definitions from industry and elsewhere that kind of try to get at the edges, but from a conceptual point of view, we're talking about precise location data. And I want to start by setting the scene of what location data is now before we talk about the anonymization point of view and the risks. So can we walk through what does it look like today to collect and use location data? Jen, can you talk about collection of location data today?
Sure. I mean, I'll talk about it from the consumer perspective. So I am pretty sure everybody in here has a smartphone and probably has had a smartphone for a very long time. I actually really started looking at this issue back in 2018 because I was staring at my iPhone, and my first smartphone was an Android phone. And for those of you who had an Android phone, back in the day, you probably remembered that there used to be a location switch kind of up front and center in the UI, and you could toggle location on and off. Because I'm a privacy researcher, I always have location off. It makes things hard, but I do it. And so I was staring at my iPhone and really trying to work through, why does the iPhone not have that capacity? I have a Bluetooth switch, I have a Wi-Fi switch, but there's no top-level toggle for location data. So I started digging into that issue, and that's when I realized that to some extent the idea of a location toggle on-off is a bit of can be misleading because location is collected through so many facets in your phone. It's not just GPS. I mean, obviously GPS gives you a great deal of precision. But your location is also picked up through Bluetooth. Your phone company obviously knows where you are and triangulates where you are based on your phone talking to cell phone towers. Apps also get location through your IP address, assuming you're on a data plan. So while the ability to toggle your GPS transmitter on and off, I think I was really focused on that as kind of a level of comfort. Then I realized, well, it's actually far more pervasive than just GPS. And so actually I wrote an op-ed on this topic because I tried to dig into it both on Android and on iOS, and quickly became very frustrated because I realized from a consumer's perspective, again, even if you are able to turn off GPS tracking on your phone, which on the iPhone, I don't know if anybody else like me does this routinely, but it's about 5 screens down. So routinely, if I bring up a Maps app, I have to go in like do, and I finally get to the toggle off, and I can go back and use it. It's a really annoying experience, but at the same time, again, it's from a consumer's perspective, it can be. I think it's almost a false sense of security if we give people a high-level toggle without kind of addressing the bigger issue of just how pervasive location can be grabbed from your phone. Again, not just with GPS, but through all these other means as well. Just to say that kind of by design, these phones are extremely leaky in terms of their capacity to tell you where you are and track you through kind of every facet of your life. And from my research and work with consumers, I would say largely most people don't grasp that fact. They're not generally aware of the extent to which companies are able to track them pervasively over time through everything they do. Sorry, I'm still getting over a cold. And so from that perspective, I think location from the consumer side is a bit of a black box. And again, people are kind of cognizant that when you bring up a mapping app or something else that asks for your location in real time, that your location is being gathered at that point in time. But the kind of systematic, long-term gathering of location that we see happening across the industry is something that I think is generally invisible to consumers.
And then once it is collected, Brandi, can you talk about some of the general uses from the commercial point of view, as well as the practices of companies that collect data in terms of retention and sale?
Yeah. I just want to also tease out a little bit more on top of what Jen's saying. We used to look at beacon technology in places like shopping malls where every store has a beacon on it. That's another access point. Geofencing certain specific locations like Madison Square Garden or other venues. Those are other areas where we collect that kind of precise geolocation data. But you see a lot of different use cases. I know you talked about mapping apps. That's a legitimate use case. We talk about weather apps. I will never download a weather app because they will sell your location data. I know because I've bought it. I used to do scary things in the geolocation space before there were settings on your Android and on your iOS phone. I used to work at one of these geolocation companies, ad networks and analytics companies that really just wanted to collect your data and sell it out. To a variety of advertisers. You look at your car these days, your car is collecting geolocation data. Your car is a computer, and it is always collecting that information, whether it's for the purpose of tracking how your vehicle works and uses, for keeping it connected for various services on the vehicle, but also they're selling that data to your insurance carrier. Okay, Ford has a deal with a number of insurance carriers. To share that data over to other parties. This is a revenue stream for them. In terms of how we used to use data at my companies, again, I mentioned I was at an ad tech company for a while. We'd pour your location over a map, and we'd know you went to Starbucks 123 on Main Street. We know you went to, you were shopping for a car because you went to 4 car dealerships in 2 weekends. We also knew where you lived. We knew where you worked. Your cell phone was at rest for 8 hours at night. Your cell phone was at rest for 8 hours during the day. We knew if you had kids and you were dropping them off at school every day. We knew if you were sick because you were going to a hospital every day. And then you start combining that with other sets of data, so we had a way to enrich and authenticate our data. We also could do cross-device tracking to your home devices. You've got a TV at home associated with an IP address. We knew, all of the things that you watched on TV, we could marry that to your cell phone and your real world data. It was actually very easy, and you could do that about 10 years ago, so it's not like it's something you can just do today. I've also worked for a online gambling app. So you guys know DraftKings and FanDuel. I didn't work for one of those companies, but for regulatory purposes, those apps have to collect your location data to make sure you are in a jurisdiction that authorizes gambling. Again, a legitimate use case. But those regulations are written in such a way that they persistently collect that data. They retain that data for a long time, sometimes indefinitely, and that data is accessible to government regulators who may then do whatever they do with it. to essentially make sure that the company is complying with the regulations, but also, who are they sharing that data with? I have no idea. There's a variety of use cases out there that I think people, if you don't work in this space and you don't think about all the different ramifications and all the different collection points and the different ways to monetize this data, it can get very complex very quickly.
Yeah, certainly, and we're going to get to the risks. So in terms of let's go ahead and transition there. What are so we've talked about collection and use and what are these practices. What are some of the risks for location data, and what have you seen being used in these areas to kind of address those risks? Maybe start with you, Beryl, about the government uses.
Yeah, so the government has plenty of reason that it might want to know the location of individuals. I think one of the most common and early uses of real-time location data for government entities and for historical data were departments of transportation that are trying to sort of figure out where they want to build new roads, whether they need more sidewalks, how many people are riding their bicycles. But increasingly we're seeing uses by law enforcement, and that's where a lot of my work focuses, because the leaky design of a lot of these apps and the consumer consent model that we currently have around a lot of the location data tracking is very convenient for law enforcement, who, members of which will regularly reference how long it takes to go through the proper channels in order to determine where people's locations are. And so we know that on the federal level, the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection, and a lot of sort of the entities that deal across countries and across borders have used this information to track individuals, but also we see local law enforcement have access to it in a way that is sort of very exciting for them, because otherwise there's a lot of paper that needs to be generated in order to find particular individuals or understand where they are. Also, a lot of the regulations, in addition to warrants and those sorts of things that they need to follow regarding the retention of particular data points, right? So if we're thinking about automated license plate readers or some of the other tools that they have to try to basically track people through time and keep a record of it, those data sets have, in general, some sort of retention period that they're supposed to be dealing with, and they get around that in a lot of ways because they look to third-party companies that are collecting that information. And similarly, we see this happening with cell phone location data. So I think there are a lot of risks that we can talk about from there.
Yeah, and so our panel, we want to get to anonymization and what this actually means for the space. And so can you, Brandi and Jen, kind of flesh out some of the risks that you see that kind of go with the uses you talked about a moment ago and the consumer's view of it, and then what can be done around anonymization, what is claimed to be done, and then what is actually practical from a technical point of view?
Okay. So from the consumer's point of view, again, there are, I don't want to write off the fact that there are some really legitimate use cases for location data. And obviously, we all benefit from some of those uses. Again, but I think the bigger concern is that there's a big difference between, giving me where my nearest restaurant is, versus keeping that data for years and years and years and years and years, and that is the theme we've seen with a lot of location data collectors, and that I think is part of what makes it difficult to just assume that you can hide in the crowd, because I think a lot of us just assume in the world of big data, I'm not interesting, I'm just a single data point. Why am I going to stick out? The problem is that location data collected over time, as Brandi was already talking about, it just reveals so much about your life. And I think if we've seen anything in the last 10 years of kind of following internet privacy issues, there's been a real big shift from this kind of sense that it's just about shopping. Who cares? I'm just going to get ads, and it's fine. I want ads. I want things to be cheaper. It's the trade-off I'm willing to make. It's great. But I think that has really begun to shift, and people are becoming much more aware that there's kind of a bigger cost you're paying. There's a couple issues I can think of just off the top of my head. One is the recent Dobbs decision, which pushed back Roe versus Wade. So suddenly, a very large population of people who can be pregnant have realized that, especially if you are a younger person in your 20s or 30s and you're actively trying to manage your fertility or seek abortion care or anything in that realm, you may live in a state now where that is a criminal act. And your phone is one of the easiest ways for law enforcement to investigate and trace that behavior. So suddenly this thing that you've been relying on for convenience is basically being weaponized against you, or has the capacity to be weaponized against you. And so for a lot of us, that is a very, very visceral concern. Again, depending on what state you're in, obviously.
Can I jump in there?
Please, yeah.
So I sit on the Minnesota Department of Transportation's Connected and Autonomous Vehicles Committee. For those of you who know your politics, Minnesota is a blue state surrounded by red states. Minneapolis has a Planned Parenthood. Minnesota is a abortion safe harbor state. I believe they're in the process of passing some additional laws to protect women. We are also 20 minutes in Minneapolis from the Wisconsin border, which is a Republican state which has prohibited and passed a number of abortion bans. I was sitting on this committee listening to a conversation about, again, legitimate uses, urban planning, road, replacing the gas tax with a usage tax, and using location data to help generate, figure that out as we move to electric vehicles, things like that. And shortly after Dobbs came down, I asked the question, who has access to all this data and who's going to protect this data from being sold? Because we now have people not only in our state, in Minnesota, who are now at risk. Our risk calculus as women has changed, half the population. But we have people who are going to be commuting over the border in from Iowa, from the Dakotas, from Wisconsin, all of which are Republican states. They're now going to be crossing the border to come to our state to use our Planned Parenthood facilities and other facilities for abortion rights. And if we are starting to track this data and make this data available to a variety of people, are we also going to share that data back with law enforcement in other states as they try to enforce those laws? Most of the committee, this government committee was men. Most of them were older. And I think I just stunned them all into silence because none of them had understood that something completely unrelated can change your risk calculus. And this is, everybody who knows me, who knows I've talked about this space before, knows, I call location data digital plutonium. Plutonium has a use, right, to power, nuclear facilities. There are valid, legitimate uses on some of this stuff, in terms of, again, the urban planning, the traffic, weather apps, those are, crucial to, people who live in states like mine. But at the end of the day, the risk factor of that data getting loose can be absolutely devastating for people.
Yeah, there's another case that I wanted to just mention briefly, which I worked with one of the reporters who reported this out, was the case of I think he was a Catholic priest. Mm-hmm. I don't know if he was a priest or some other former clergy, who was outed for visiting gay bars. And part of that, the whole way he was outed was through somebody purchasing his location data. They obviously knew who he was. They were suspicious that he was doing this. They were able to map his device ID to a specific location, probably where he lived. And then specifically, buy data for that location, identify his device, and then, further buy additional data to, track his behavior over time, and then publicly outed for that behavior. Just to kind of highlight the point that, there's no laws preventing this right now. And so, you may yourself say, I have nothing to hide. Why should I be worried? And I would just make 2 points about that. Firstly, everybody has something to hide in the sense that you don't necessarily want every aspect of your life, available for purchase and publicized. Even if you think I'm law-abiding, I don't do anything strange, you still have something in your life that you may find you want to protect. from that as well, it's not just you, it's everybody else in this room, it's everybody else around us. So part of, I think, the real challenge here too is it is not just about all of us as individuals. Our location data is also used basically to kind of inform on all of us. And so it becomes this collective societal level problem in terms of how our data is used. So even though I always have GPS turned off on my phone, this panel is probably not representative, but if the rest of you have it on, and yet I also, let's say I don't turn off Bluetooth, like there are ways to basically triangulate kind of where I've been based on where you all have been as well. So just to say that, like, as much as I try to individually fight this problem, it's a collective problem. It involves all of us and the way our data is used broadly and collected broadly. So there's only kind of so much any one of us can do. And that, I think, is one of the kind of underlying unfairness issues with the collection of location data is, again, it's not so much that like individual point in time, it's the aggregation of it, across time, across boundaries, not just by a single company, but by so many companies, and the ability to take that data, combine it with other data points. Again, all of this
so
is
easy
unregulated.
too.
Yeah,
it is
it's
so
all
easy.
unregulated, and that's what ends up kind of informing on all of us.
So when you really tease this out in terms of like what anonymization would look like what would it look like, and is it doable? Like, is there a way to get the benefit while drastically reducing the risks for location data, and what would that look like from your vantage points?
I mean, I've seen companies claim that you can anonymize this data by truncating, the first, and let's say you're taking a journey in a car, right? You can truncate the start, the first 5 minutes at the start of the journey and the last 5 minutes at the end of the journey. I'm not sure I buy any of those arguments, to be honest with you, because, the companies that claim that they do that are also the same companies that are out there saying, hey, we sell this data to advertisers, and I know for a fact that that the advertisers want to know you went to that Starbucks 123 on Main Street. And if you don't have the endpoint of that journey, how can you tell that they went to Starbucks 123 on Main Street? I've seen people use hashing. I've seen people use, any number of, pseudonymous IDs. I think, this is a pretty sophisticated audience. We know how easy it is to unravel those. We know how easy it is to do probabilistic data matching. So I hope somebody here has a better technology than I do or a solution than I do. I have yet to see anything that can really, truly anonymize any of this data.
Yeah. And I think, the anonymization, particularly for law enforcement and government, feels to be sort of like a wiggly space because there are certain definitions that can be used. And then as long as, law enforcement is not stepping into those definitions, they can kind of proceed with this data. So, one company that we've been researching is a company called Fog Data Science, and they seem to be directly related to Ventel based on marketing materials that both companies use, Ventel being another large data broker that sells information to CBP and DHS in general. And one of the things that they put as they're marketing to law enforcement is that there's no personally identifiable information that is being sold because this location data is not being linked to a particular name or to, in some cases, a cell phone number. And so when it gets sold to law enforcement feels as though they are not actually buying PII because that is what they've been told, and that is sort of like the veneer that has been placed around this data set. But we also know that law enforcement has purchased this data or access to the system, which isn't just the data, it's like sort of a nice interface which they can use to essentially geofence particular locations. And they have acknowledged, right, like this is kind of PII, but if we're any good at our jobs, we're going to be able to figure out who these people are. And it's obvious that they're trying to find particular individuals because one of the main reasons that they'll use to try to access this information is something like human trafficking. So when we think about sort of whether it's possible to anonymize data, it seems basically not, and anonymization is kind of a way to pass information along that would otherwise be obviously too sensitive.
So I did a little bit of kind of research review before today's event. You find consistently, paper after paper after paper where people are arguing that they can re-identify through location data. And I think it's a couple things. Again, it's how long data is collected, it's how long you keep it for, and it's your capacity to also bring in outside information. And to the extent that, I think Brandi's experience is probably illustrative. Companies make all these claims about anonymizing data, but at the end of the day, if you buy an anonymized data set, I'm assuming that it's trivial to then buy additional data to enhance it and to try to re-identify people. We just don't have guardrails kind of in place to prevent these things from happening as part of the challenge.
Yeah, let's be real. Like you said, we don't have the guardrails. We don't have the laws to protect against this. We don't have, something like a BIPA, right? The Illinois Biometric Information Protection Act. What we have are notice and consent laws here, largely, that are based on a privacy policy. And as I jokingly tell people, having written about 500 of these over the last decade.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know, right? I tell my friends, I write the things that nobody reads. Click yes to accept. And
I read them if that helps.
I am one of the only people that read them. In fact, I was reading the NFLs at a basketball, at an NBA game. So, hey, I guess I'm that kind of nerd. But, realistically, the consents for these things are buried in privacy policies. And, it is so easy to re-identify and rematch data. Hypothetically, I'll give you an example. If I have the geolocation, the GPS coordinates of, my device, which is sitting at my house, I bought a house last year. My house is now public record, right? There's a deed with the county, for tax purposes and everything, and it's got my name on it, and that's, you can go down and buy that information. That's what home warranty companies do when they sell you all those home warranty things and send them to you in the mail all the time. The DMV has my address on file, and the DMV leaks like a sieve. They sell data like no tomorrow in every state. It doesn't matter. Now you can combine that GPS location, which you have on a map, with all of this deterministic data that's available for sale for pretty cheap, and the tools are very easy to recombine that with. You don't even have to go and get fancy IP addresses or other identifiers, ad IDs, IDFAs, AAIDs. You can just literally go and buy public records, and that's what's happening at these data brokers. And I think this is why, not to put Aaron on the spot here, but this is why the Kochava case is really, really interesting right now. Because the data brokers are making this data available to everybody, private sector, that Grindr case, I think it was Grindr is where the data came from in that case. Down in Texas with the Catholic priest, that data was acquired from a data broker who got their data from the DMV and from Grindr and other apps. And I think, this is where, data leaks like a sieve. It goes everywhere. Once it's out there on the internet, it's so easy. And as we can tell from all of the ransomware and the hacking, that's, kind of pretty constant these days. I don't think you go on the social media and not see that there's, another data breach. This data is not just in the hands of, quote unquote, legitimate data brokers who have a legitimate business model and theoretically a license to the data to resell it. But they also have, all these bad actors who have access to the data. So I think, this Kochava case is going to be extremely interesting in terms of the geolocation sector and whether or not they're able to, kind of limit downstream the ability of companies to resell and recombine that data with other data sets.
Yeah, and I should say these views are mine and not those of the Federal Trade Commission. But I will say that, without commenting on any specifics of ongoing litigation, I encourage you all to look at the public complaint that the FTC filed against Kochava. It's on ftc.gov if you search for Kochava, and it's about the unfair sale of sensitive location data. And I will say no more about that other than please read the complaint. It's very visceral. And gives a lot of details.
So I want to add, right, when law enforcement is accessing this data, they are, in addition to feeling as though there's no PII involved, they're receiving it under the impression that it is 100% opt-in consent for whatever that is worth, as we've heard. And two things that I really want to highlight, right, are that one, laws change, and two, police are people and people are people, right? And so if we're thinking about access to abortion care or health care in general, if we're thinking about different political issues that have obviously been cropping up in our country, whether that be elections or immigration, the fact that law enforcement can access this information and without proper oversight in such a way that it's not as though they are going through the warrant process. In some of these cases, any random police officer can sort of geofence any random location and have a sense of which devices were in those locations. And so there's a huge risk when it comes to law enforcement, but also because just the consumer market is so open, we're seeing situations in which, right, this information has been bought and used to try to demonstrate that there has been election tampering. One recent and very scary use case that has happened in the last couple of months has been related to nonprofits and other individuals who are helping people who are coming into this country from the southern border. And there's been one organization that has bought this information, geofenced the locations of different immigration detention centers, and then tracked all of the people who came in and out of those detention centers. And as part of that so-called report that they were working on, they acknowledged that they obtained this information without being clear about where they obtained it, but that they were able to track individuals to their homes and to other locations. And don't worry, we know that those people aren't the undocumented immigrants that we're referring to. Those are just people that we know are helping them. And so you can imagine a use case, where somebody doesn't even necessarily need to know who these people are. They just know that these people have a different political view than they have, and they don't like it.
Yeah, it's the bleeding of this into politics is really becoming a thing. I mean, I was tracking the use of location data by political campaigns, which is much more around like geofencing at rallies and trying to figure out like who's showing up for targeting you, for fundraising. But I think you raised the really good point that we're also seeing this weaponized because there are lots of, we'll say, dark money groups out there that are kind of willing to fund, people on the ground and especially you look at things like school boards, for example. Like a lot of the races in different school boards around the country are becoming extremely political. And it's not just kind of the politics, I think, the local politics, but it's also the fact that you're seeing other players get involved in this space and willing to kind of put the money in to say, well, let's find out who the opposition is and kind of involve people in opposition research. So like I said earlier, I think it's really going beyond the consumer boundaries of just my shopping habits into kind of really darker space that I think potentially can affect people much more personally and viscerally than simply I get too much spam.
Yeah, we've also seen reporters have their geolocation tracked as well while they're trying to meet with sources and they're reporting on particularly sensitive issues. Those stories have been cropping up for years. We've also seen this data being available on, like I said, both the data brokers and on, quote unquote, the dark web. After it's been breached, we're seeing this used in national security, right? Your Fitbits. A few years ago, we saw the New York Times did a series of exposés where they had to ban Strava and Fitbits from military bases because the guys were running around laps and they were running around the the boundaries of the base, and you could basically use their location data to map out a base. We've seen people tracked from Langley in those stories, where the CIA headquarters are. We've seen people tracked from the Supreme Court back to their homes. So, this particular data is, weaponized both domestically by these political parties, many of which are organized as 501c3s and other organizations. And I should point out that, we have all these modern privacy laws coming into effect. We've got California with the CCPA, we've got Utah, Connecticut, Colorado, and Virginia going into effect this year, and more states have proposed privacy laws. But almost all of those laws have carve-outs for nonprofits that they don't apply. So any of these new laws that apply to that would cover this geolocation data, that would put purpose limitations and minimization on them, would require cybersecurity protections and DPIAs and DSARs and all these other acronyms of things that we do to mitigate risk. They have huge carve-outs for a lot of the entities that use this data. And I just want to piggyback, circle back to the whole consent issue. Let's be realistic. When you open a weather app and you consent to the use of your location data for a weather app, you're using it to get the weather in your location. My mom does not understand that she is now consenting to sell that data downstream to a number of data brokers. Consent is the fiction at the center of our profession. It's a fiction, because if my mother doesn't understand what she's consenting to, then it's not a valid consent. And none of the consent strings and none of the consents that are being collected and none of the consents that any of these people are relying on mean a damn thing. I'll be done being spicy.
Oh no, I absolutely. Jen, do you want to pick up on that? So one of my questions in transitioning to, so what do we do? What does the regulatory landscape look like? What is it for an individual? What does that landscape look like? I kind of want to start with the individual. Like what can an individual do in this situation, if anything, to mitigate the risks of their own location data being collected and used?
Sure. Turning off GPS on your phone when you're not using it, is a very small thing you can do, but it does take some data out of circulation. Do you also want to turn off Bluetooth in every public space? It becomes this long list of hygiene that you have to try to remember. I'm usually good with GPS. I'm not always good with Bluetooth personally. Starting at the micro level. We could go back to dumb phones. That's what I bought my 13-year-old. He wasn't very happy about it, but tough. He uses the phone a lot less than his friends, I will tell you that.
Pretty sure the drug dealers also use dumb phones. Right. I think there was an article out there about them loving the candy bar phones from back the Nokias from 15 years ago.
Definitely. So I always get asked these types of questions from the press, and it's a really tough one because as an individual, I think it just highlights somewhat some of the futility. There's only so much you can do. Are you going to read all the privacy policies? Not likely. Even if you did, is there anything you can do? No, not really, other than not use whatever service you want to use. You have no negotiation rights there. So what can you do? Hopefully this congressional session, we may see ADPA come back into play, which is the federal level privacy law that was proposed last session. It's kind of controversial to say here in California, but I'll just, we do need a federal level law. So we'll see if that gets any traction this time around. I think bigger picture, the first level I think is going to actually get some regulations in place and some boundaries in place over what can be collected and what it can be used for and how long it could be kept. That will help at least somewhat, I think, in terms of kind of the runaway collection and sale we see today. I think in a longer term scenario, the consent question is still a really relevant one. We haven't mentioned Apple's ad tracking transparency measure. That's had extremely huge uptake from what we can tell, or at least what kind of people from the outside are telling us. So when I hear a lot of consumers don't care, it's well, actually, if you put the choice in front of them, most of us say, no, we don't want to be tracked. And so consumers do care if actually given a real choice and not just a false choice. But longer term, I think one of the areas that I tend to focus on in my research is trying to think through how do we change the entire data ecosystem? How do we change all this? I think we need to shift away from models where companies collect our data and that we basically have zero control over it, to one where we generally are the stewards of our own data, or we have data intermediaries that steward that data, and that basically we delegate our kind of decision making to a data intermediary in terms of what do I want shared, who do I want to share it with, and we take so much of this out of these high stakes consent models that, as Brandi and Beryl have really pointed out, they don't make any sense. None of us read this stuff, and again, it's mostly false consent. We don't understand what we're being asked, and it's it's too complex of an issue. And so part of this is rethinking, I would argue, the entire data ecosystem and shifting more towards data that's more directly under our control, and maybe that we license out for use. A lot of people talk about this in ownership terms. You need to own your own data. I'm sorry to throw cold water on that. It's not really about ownership per se. It's the more unsexy term of licensing. But it is much more of like you're licensing your data for use by others. Maybe you get direct financial benefits from it. That's one of the things that's often kind of circulating in this space. If I own my own data, I can get paid for it. Unfortunately, you probably won't get paid much. But really, we're talking about kind of shifting the terms fundamentally so that it's less about like every actor in this universe having at stake at trying to get your data, and you potentially having more direct control and kind of more broadly trying to decide who you share with and under what conditions.
So what would it take to achieve that vision? If you pull all the levers, the legal levers, the company practices levers, and whatnot, like what's needed to pave the way for that vision?
So there are actually companies in this space. I don't know if there's anybody in this space in this room. I mean, we're seeing these models, I think, begin to emerge in the B2B space to some extent. In big research projects, I think there's been more of a focus on trying to think about how we kind of build. The term we use a lot is data trusts. How do you build a data trust? That still gives kind of the people in that data set rights over their data. I think there's some momentum beginning to build in this space, but honestly, I think the big nudge would be, let's say, a government regulator telling a company they had to divest their data as part of an, anti-monopoly measure, quite honestly. Like, that would be the big kick, I think, that would actually really get this moving. I realize that's probably a very controversial thing to say, but, until the momentum builds, I think, data divestiture might be one of the things that actually kicks it over the threshold.
I love that, and disgorgement of profits. Just putting it out there, if it's going to cost you a lot of money to do something that's very bad from a privacy perspective, and not just say a $5 billion fine when, your company makes, $100 billion a quarter. That can feel like a little bit of a slap on the wrist and a cost of doing business. And I think we all know who I'm referring to with that $5 billion fine. Thank you for sponsoring our conference. I want to put it out there too that one of the reasons that the privacy problems are so hard in the tech space is the economics of the internet and the economics of these companies are built on advertising. And advertising is built on personal data. And so at a certain level, we are fighting the economics of the internet. We're fighting the economics of the venture capitalists and trillions of dollars invested in ad tech. We're fighting Google. Also, thank you for sponsoring our conference. And I think there are, some really hard challenges in terms of how do we finance our development costs, because, let's be real, none of us are cheap in this room. And certainly office space and computers and, servers and things like that are not free. So I think there are some very serious challenges in terms of how we conceptualize the economics of the internet and how we, privacy is wrapped around those issues. And that's why, I kind of always say, something Upton Sinclair. I think Upton Sinclair was quoted as saying, it's difficult to get a man to understand that which his paycheck relies upon him not understanding. So, I know we're kind of running short on time here, but I wanted to throw one other thing back at you, Beryl. With your expertise with the government, which is, I really think we have to do a better job of making sure that the government cannot just buy this data, and making sure that the government departments that have access to this data cannot share it with other departments. I think location data, as I said before, digital plutonium, is so extremely dangerous in terms of what it can, expose people to from a risk perspective. And so, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that in terms of the government side of this, but none of these laws apply to government. CCPA, et cetera, don't apply to government.
Right, yeah, I think we're fighting against the economics, but the government also has an interest in allowing this to continue to be bought and sold. And so even when we're thinking about the American, the Data Privacy Act that didn't get through last congressional session. One of the sort of definitional wiggle spaces in that bill, which EFF didn't support as it was written, had to do with the fact that some of these data brokers were just sort of reclassified as some sort of service provider, which would have allowed them to continue to basically do the same thing, a government service provider. And so, I think short and, with that law, it was going to sort of undermine some of the existing state laws. And so I think there is action on the state level that can happen, and there are sort of like pieces of the puzzle or bites that can be taken at the state level, right? California has passed a law that won't allow the sharing of information with other states that are going to be using it for abortion prosecutions. And so if there are sort of specific ways that laws can get put on the books that sort of limit some of the ways that the information is bought and sold, I think we can make a little bit of progress, but I agree that there needs to be some sort of overarching standards, because it's a lot for local law enforcement and for state law enforcement to, they don't always 100% know what the laws are, so they're not always totally following them. And we're seeing, just across the surveillance space in general, right, the use of these third-party companies to collect the information on behalf of the government and then resell it to the government is huge, and it does sort of bypass a lot of the laws that exist when it comes to sort of cross-jurisdictional information sharing. So, it's a bit of a...
Wyden proposed a law.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say Wyden proposed something last year, but I guess what the chances of it being passed are.
Right, yeah, I don't know exactly what the chances are of anything being passed, but it would be nice if the Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act would get through, because it does try to address some of these issues and sort of speaks to, in its name, the problem that we're seeing, which is that the Fourth Amendment protections that we're supposed to have in the Constitution are being circumvented because capitalism.
Can I just tie this all back globally too? So I don't know if any of you guys know who Max Schrems is and have been dealing with Schrems 2 and cross-border data transfer and the collapse of multiple treaties that allow data to be shared from the EU to the US. But the fact that we are undermining our own Fourth Amendment protections here in the United States actually has an impact on our ability to operate multinationals. There's a very negative impact from a commercial perspective in terms of being able to run our businesses because we're not protecting privacy at home. And I don't think this point gets made enough, that we need to do a better job of protecting US citizens and other people who live here, and the data that is brought here from overseas. When we allow these kind of loopholes to circumvent, that undermines our ability to work with other countries in other regions like the European Union and the UK with UK GDPR and all these other countries with GDPR-like laws, because they don't want to transfer the data to us because we're not a safe jurisdiction. So, these are problems we have to solve for international business to proceed. This isn't just like a civil liberties problem. I'm not standing on my soapbox as a liberal trying to protect, women's rights or, individual privacy. I'm also thinking about this from how do I scale a business and operate globally if I can't bring that data back here? Well, now I got to park servers in the EU, but access is a transfer. So now I got to park personnel in the EU. So now we have a growth and we have a huge systemic problem to expand and grow our businesses, and it doubles and triples and quadruples our costs of doing business globally. And I know there's a lot of people in this room that are thinking about scaling problems and operating internationally. So I do want to, make sure we tie that back.
So we talk about what to do about this problem, and the ranges are blow up the economics of the internet, change the whole data ecosystem,
world peace.
World peace. I'm curious. We have about a minute and a half till questions. If you were to really take kind of the most powerful one practice or thing that you could do from a legal standpoint, or from a new law or whatnot, what would that be that would have the highest reduction of privacy risk in this space to start?
Federal BIPA, but for location data.
Okay, and can you just briefly say what that would do and why that's important?
Companies are terrified of BIPA because of the cost of a class action litigation. right? Just once you get past, once you get to the discovery phase, the costs of litigation skyrocket. And you're talking millions of dollars in lawyers. You're talking millions of dollars in doc review. You're talking people taken away from doing their jobs and sitting in depositions. You don't even have to get to litigation. That class action threat makes BIPA the most effective privacy law in this country, by far. And you're just now seeing, I think, the ramifications of that. If we had a federal level, because BIPA is Illinois only, if we had a federal level location law with that kind of enforcement attached to it, because that's the key, right? It's enforcement, it's cost, it's making a harm for doing bad things with this type of data, that would see companies be more responsible. You have to have some teeth behind this.
I would land somewhere between really strict limits on how long data is kept. I mean, really strict. I'm like, would I say hours? Would I say days? Would I even go a week? I don't know. I need to really think about it. And potentially some form of consumer engagement where consumers are actually given a very explicit, clear choice on kind of like, do I want it collected? Do I want it sold? How long do I want it kept for? Because again, we're seeing with iOS and ad tracking transparency that people are, when given them the choice, they're generally making decisions kind of highly in favor of being more restrictive in this area.
Yeah, I think I would go for maybe a combination of these. I think it would be nice if I, as an individual, could say, I only consented to you having my information, and now that you've sold that or you bought it, I can come after you because you're essentially stalking me and you've sold this very important information. So I think if there were some mechanism, like a law, that would allow me as an individual to say, this information is mine and only mine unless I very clearly said to you, you could have it, that would be very cool.
And with that, I think we're at time. I want to thank each of you. Thank you so much for the thoughtful panel and for your time and expertise.